Tonight, at Chicago's darkest night, a crime boss decides to make a fool of a poor maid in front of the entire underworld. He calls her name onto the dance floor, not out of admiration, but to humiliate her. The whole room erupts in laughter, but when the music starts, the laughter dies down. No one suspects that this invisible woman harbors a secret that could change the entire map of the city's underground power structure. Like and comment on the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has progressed. And stay tuned, because this is just the beginning. The Black Rose Gala came once a year, and every year it reminded Chicago's underworld of one simple, brutal truth. There were people in this city who owned the dark, and there were people who merely survived inside it. Serena Vale had spent the last 11 months surviving. She stood in the service corridor behind the main ballroom, her white uniform pressed flat against the cold marble wall, holding a silver tray of champagne flutes she had refilled 3 times already because the guests kept drinking faster than she could keep up. The noise from inside was enormous. Voices layered over voices, laughter that sounded nothing like joy, and underneath all of it the low hum of a string quartet that had been playing for 2.5 hours without stopping. Her feet hurt. The left shoe had a seam that bit into her ankle every time she took a step, and she'd been taking steps since 4 in the afternoon. She was 24 years old, and she felt like something much older. The corridor smelled like floor wax and cigarette smoke drifting in from somewhere she couldn't identify. Through the gap in the service door, she could see slivers of the ballroom, chandeliers the size of small cars, tables draped in black linen, men in suits that cost more than her yearly salary standing in tight clusters, measuring each other without appearing to do so. That was the thing about powerful men, she had learned. They never looked directly at what they wanted. They always looked slightly to the side of it, cataloging it with their peripheral vision, as if to look straight at something was to admit it had value you hadn't assigned it yet. Damian Moretti looked at everything that way. She had worked in his household for 11 months, long enough to know his habits, his silences, the particular way his jaw set when someone had said something that irritated him but hadn't yet risen to the level of requiring a response, long enough to learn which rooms to avoid after 10 at night and which hallways were safe, long enough to understand, without being told directly, the basic architecture of fear that held his empire together. She had never spoken to him, not once. In 11 months of cleaning his private corridors, laundering the sheets in the guest quarters, polishing the floors of rooms she was not allowed to enter fully, only to reach inside with a mop, she had existed for Damian Moretti the way a lamp existed. Functional, ambient, invisible. She preferred it that way. The tray was getting heavy. She shifted it to her other hand and checked the time on the small clock bolted to the corridor wall. 8:47. She had until 10 before the kitchen staff rotation brought someone to relieve her, and then she would walk 6 blocks to the bus stop and take the 47 line home to the apartment she shared with a woman named Dora, who worked nights at a laundromat and whom she barely ever saw, which suited them both fine. That was the plan. That was the plan until the service door opened without warning, and a man she recognized as Tomas, one of Damian Moretti's personal assistants, stepped into the corridor and looked directly at her with an expression that was not apologetic. "You," he said. "They need more champagne in the main room. Take those in." "I usually—" She stopped. She started again. "I usually stay out here. The kitchen sends someone else for the main floor." The someone else dropped a tray and got sent home. Tomas said this with the flat effect of a man reporting weather conditions. "You're going in. Keep your head down. Don't make eye contact with anyone. Refill when the glasses are low. You know how to do that." It was not a question. She knew how to do that. She went in. The main ballroom of the Moretti estate had been built in 1924 by a man whose name no one in this room would have recognized, and it had passed through 7 different owners before Damian's father acquired it in 1989 and turned it into the centerpiece of what would eventually become the most feared private organization in the Midwest. The ceiling was 30 feet high. The floors were white Carrara marble imported from Italy, and they were so well maintained that Serena could see her own reflection in them as she moved along the edge of the room, tray raised, eyes exactly where Tomas had told her to keep them, down and forward, tracking the hemline of the nearest table and nothing else. The room was full, maybe 150 people, maybe more. She recognized faces from the photographs that sometimes appeared in the city section of the newspaper, captioned with job titles that had nothing to do with what those men actually did. A city alderman, a state-level prosecutor whose name she'd heard on the radio twice in the past month in connection with an investigation that had apparently already gone quiet. 3 men she knew from their cars. She had polished the stone steps outside when they'd been parked there for meetings that lasted past midnight. She kept moving. Refill the low glasses. Don't slow down. Don't stop unless someone addresses you directly, and pray no one addresses you directly. She was near the far end of the room, reaching across a table to top off a glass that had been abandoned midway, when she heard the shift in the ambient noise. Not silence. The room didn't go silent. But there was a change in pressure, the way a room changes when the most important person in it decides to speak. Conversations didn't stop. They just tilted, the way flowers tilt toward light, without the flowers understanding they were doing it. She straightened, turned slightly to navigate around a cluster of people, and found herself 3 feet from Damian Moretti. He was standing with a group of 4 men she didn't know, holding a glass of whiskey he hadn't finished, saying something low and brief that made 2 of the 4 men laugh. He was taller than she'd realized. She'd always seen him from a distance, or moving through hallways where she'd pressed herself flat against a wall. In person, in the full light of the chandeliers, he was the kind of man who made a room feel smaller simply by occupying it. Not because of his size, though he was large, because of the quality of his attention. Even when he was speaking to someone else, there was a sense that nothing in his immediate environment was going unregistered, including her. She turned to move away. Her left shoe caught on a slight unevenness in the marble. She'd felt it before when she'd waxed this section of floor, knew it was there, had somehow miscalculated where she was in the room, and the tray tilted. She caught it. 3 glasses shifted, but none fell. She steadied herself, breath tight in her chest. When she looked up, Damian Moretti was watching her. Not looking, watching. The distinction was precise. She dropped her gaze immediately and moved to go around him. "Hold on!" His voice was exactly what she would have predicted and nothing like she'd imagined. Low, not loud. The kind of voice that didn't need to raise itself because it expected to be heard. She stopped. "Look at me." She looked at him. He studied her for a moment with that peripheral vision quality she'd noticed in powerful men, except now it was directed at her with its full weight. His eyes were dark and had the particular flatness of someone who had taught themselves, deliberately, not to telegraph what they were thinking. "You work here," he said. It was not a question either. "Yes, sir." "How long?" 11 months, sir." Something crossed his face, not quite surprise. More like the minor recalibration of a man who had not expected a number that large. He turned slightly toward the men he'd been speaking with, and she recognized the shift before it happened, recognized it the way you recognize the intake of breath before a blow. 11 months, he said to the group, and there was something in his voice now that hadn't been there before, something performative and precise. "She's cleaned my house for 11 months, and I don't know her name." He looked back at her. The smile he wore was not the kind that involved warmth. "What's your name?" "Serena," she said. "Serena Vale. Serena Vale." He said it like he was turning it over. "Do you dance, Serena Vale?" The room around her had begun to shift. She hadn't noticed it happening, but it had. The nearest conversations quieting, heads turning with the slow inevitability of people who sensed entertainment and were helpless to resist it. She could feel it on her skin, that subtle expansion of attention, like a current of air that meant nothing good. "No, sir," she said. It was a lie. She knew it was a lie. She was certain he didn't know that, and she needed him not to know that. And she needed this conversation to end with her moving back into the invisible current of the room where trays and uniforms and downcast eyes were armor. Damian Moretti looked at her for one more moment. Then he looked at the man to his left. Heavy-set, silver-haired, wearing an expression of expectant amusement. And something passed between them, wordless and decided. "The orchestra's been playing for 3 hours, Damian said. He raised his voice just enough. Not shouting, just enough. "I think they'd appreciate something interesting." He extended his hand toward her, not quite touching, the gesture framed for observation. And Serena understood, with complete and cold clarity, exactly what was happening. This was not an invitation. This was an exhibition. He was not asking her to dance because he wanted to dance with her. He was asking her to stumble, to hesitate, to stand on a ballroom floor in a white servant's uniform and confirm for every powerful person in this room that she was what she appeared to be. Someone whose purpose was to be invisible, and who became absurd the moment visibility was forced on her. She could say no. She almost said no. The word was there, in her throat, reasonable and correct and safe. The silver-haired man chuckled. Beside him, another man was already lifting his glass, settling in for the show. Something old and cold moved through her, from her sternum, down into her hands. She took the tray and set it carefully on the nearest table. She straightened. She said, "All right." The orchestra director, a lean man in his 60s named Carver, who had been playing events like this for 20 years and had long since stopped being surprised by what the wealthy and the dangerous requested, looked up when the Moretti Estates head of house came to him with a quiet word. He glanced across the room. He saw the woman in the white uniform. He saw Damien Moretti's expectant posture. He understood the situation in roughly 3 seconds. He picked up his baton, and then he paused. Because the woman was already walking toward the center of the floor, and there was something in the way she walked that made him stop and look twice. Not fast, not anxious. She moved with the particular deliberate quality of someone who understood how a room worked, how sight lines operated, how the journey from one point to another could function as its own kind of statement if you let it. He chose a waltz, not a simple one. The violins began. She had been 12 years old when her grandmother first put her hand on the small of her back and said, in that particular voice that left no room for argument, "You are going to learn this because your body needs to know what it is capable of. Not to perform for anyone, not to impress. Because the day will come when you need to trust yourself completely, and trust begins with the body." Her grandmother had been born in Bratislava in 1941. She had survived things she never named directly, and some she named in fragments, late at night, in the way old people sometimes speak to the dark when they think no one is listening. She had trained in competitive ballroom dancing at a time when such training required extraordinary discipline and no money whatsoever, because money was not available and discipline was all there was. She had competed across 4 countries and won in 2. She had come to America at 38 with a suitcase and a method, and eventually a granddaughter who had her same bone structure and her same stubborn jaw. She had died when Serena was 19, before the poverty set in fully, before the jobs that went nowhere, and the apartment that shrank every year, and the particular erosion of possibility that happened quietly, without announcing itself, until you looked up one day and realized you were in a place you had not chosen. She had given Serena 7 years of her method, 7 years of the body knows, of cold mornings in the small living room of a house that smelled like lavender and old wood, of correction and repetition and the understanding that excellence was not a performance, it was a state. Serena had not danced in 5 years. The music found her anyway. She was not thinking about any of this when she stepped onto the floor. She was thinking about the seam in her left shoe and the tray she had left on the table and the fact that she was about to do something that could not be undone, in front of people whose memory was long and whose context for what they were seeing was already fixed. The first bar of music moved through her like a current. Her spine found itself. Her shoulders dropped. Her arms lifted. And something happened in the room. She felt it before she could see it. A change in the sound. Not the music, which continued at the same register, but the ambient noise of voices and glasses and movement that had been the room's constant texture. That texture thinned more. She completed her first turn and caught the faces of the people nearest to her, and what she saw was not the anticipatory amusement she had seen before. It was something else. The silver-haired man had stopped smiling. 3 women near the east wall had turned fully to face her. The alderman she'd recognized earlier had set down his glass. She did not stop. She would not stop. Whatever this was, whatever was happening in the room, the only direction available to her was forward, through the music, through the measures, through the thing her grandmother had given her, and that no poverty or humiliation or 11 months of invisible labor had managed to take away. She danced. The quartet moved with her. She could feel them adjusting, giving the music more room, the way good musicians do when something real is happening on the floor. The waltz opened. She moved through it with the technique that had lived in her muscles for 15 years, not perfectly. She was 5 years out of practice, her body not quite at the precision it had once held. But close enough, her arms carrying the memory of 100 cold mornings, her feet finding the floor the way they were built to find it. She didn't look at Damien Moretti. She looked nowhere, the way her grandmother had taught her. You do not perform for anyone. You do not look at faces. You find the middle distance and you live there. The middle distance. The music swelling, the room. The room had gone almost completely silent. But Damien stood where she'd left him, glass still in his hand, the smile he'd arranged on his face for the room's benefit, now entirely absent. He was watching the woman on his ballroom floor and trying to locate the feeling he was having, which was not a feeling he had a ready category for. He had expected awkwardness. He had expected the specific embarrassment of someone overestimating themselves in public, which was an embarrassment he had weaponized before and would have weaponized now, casually, without particular malice, not because he disliked her. He had no position on her whatsoever, but because the moment had presented itself and the audience was right, and these things were useful. They reinforced certain understandings about the nature of this room. What he had not expected was this. She was not awkward. She was not stumbling. She was not doing anything that could be called attempting. She was simply dancing, with a completeness that made the space around her feel organized in a way it hadn't been before. With a quality that he had seen, rarely, in people who were operating at the exact intersection of training and something else, something that couldn't be trained, something that either lived in you or didn't. Beside him, the silver-haired man, whose name was Victor Barone, who was 67 years old and who had been attending events like this for 40 years, said nothing, which, for Victor Barone, was an extremely loud statement. Damien heard it. The orchestra was not holding back anymore. He could hear it. Carver, the old director, had leaned into whatever this was. The music was fuller. The room had entirely stopped talking. She completed a sequence, a turn into an extension, her arms finding a line that was almost architectural, and the woman near the east wall made a small, involuntary sound. Not a word, just a sound. The kind people make when they see something beautiful without intending to respond to it. Damien put his glass down. He was not aware of doing it. The last measure arrived and departed, and she held the final position for 2 beats, 3, the music trailing, and then she lowered her arms, and the room came apart. It was not immediate. There was a half-second of silence that felt enormous, the kind of silence that follows something that needs a moment before the response to it is possible. And then the applause started, and it was not polite applause, not the kind that gets produced by people fulfilling a social expectation. It was real. A man near the back of the room stood up, and then 3 more people did, and within 10 seconds the standing ovation was comprehensive. Serena stood on the marble floor breathing. Her heart was going fast. Her hands were shaking slightly, which no one could see because her arms were at her sides. Her left ankle burned where the seam had been working at it for hours. She turned and found Damien Moretti looking at her with an expression she had never seen on a powerful man before. The expression of someone who has miscalculated badly and is in the process of understanding what the miscalculation has cost him. She held his gaze for 1 second. Then she walked back toward her tray. She picked it up. She was reaching for the nearest glass when a hand closed around her wrist. Not Damien, someone she didn't know. An older man with silver hair and eyes that had seen a great deal and were now looking at her with an intensity that sent a cold current through her chest that had nothing to do with dancing. He was staring at her neckline, at something beneath the collar of her uniform where a thin chain rested against her sternum. Her grandmother's pendant. She never took it off. She never thought about it. It was simply there, the way her own skin was there. The old man's face had gone the color of old ash. "Where?" he said, and his voice was not the voice of a man asking a social question. "Did you get that?" She tried to step back. His grip held. "That pendant," he said. "That mark." His eyes moved from the chain to her face, and she saw something in them that she had no framework for. Recognition, and behind it, something that looked almost like fear. "What is your name? Your full name?" "Let go of me," she said. He did not let go. "Your family name," he said. "What is your family name?" And the party continued around them, oblivious, the applause fading, glasses being raised, and no one noticed what was happening in this small corner of the room except one man standing 8 feet away who had put down his drink and was watching with the absolute concentrated stillness of someone who had just recognized that something had shifted in his world, something he didn't yet understand but knew. With the certainty that came from 20 years of surviving in rooms like this one, that he needed to understand very soon. Damien Moretti took one step toward them, and from somewhere in the crowd behind Serena, barely audible beneath the resumed sound of voices and music, came the soft, specific click of a safety being released. The click was small, barely anything, the kind of sound that gets swallowed whole in a room full of voices and crystal and the residual warmth of applause. Most people would not have heard it. Most people were not listening the way Damien Moretti had trained himself to listen over 20 years of rooms where the wrong noise meant the wrong outcome. He was moving before he'd consciously decided to move. His hand found Victor Barone's wrist first, not Serena's, not the threat he couldn't see yet, because Barone was the known quantity, the old man with the gray face and the grip that hadn't released, and you cleared what was in front of you before you addressed what was behind. He applied pressure to the inside of Barone's wrist, not violently, just at the specific point where the tendons ran close to the surface, and Barone let go of Serena with a sharp exhale through his nose. "Step back," Damien said to him, very quietly. Barone stepped back. His eyes never left Serena's neckline. In the same motion, Damien turned, putting himself between Serena and the direction the sound had come from. His hand was at his side. Behind him, he heard Serena's breathing, fast, controlled, the breathing of someone who was frightened and refusing to let it show, and he cataloged that without looking at her because he needed his eyes on the room. The room was still moving, still talking. The standing ovation had dissolved back into the normal churn of a party, and no one in the immediate vicinity appeared to have heard what he'd heard or registered what was happening in this particular 8-foot radius. That was either luck or staging, and he didn't believe in luck. His head of security, a man named Reeves, who was built like a doorframe and who Damien paid an exceptional amount of money to be precisely where he was needed, materialized at his left shoulder within 4 seconds. "Southeast corner," Damien said. "Just that." Reeves moved. Damien turned to Serena. She was holding the tray, both hands on it, white-knuckled, the glasses on it trembling slightly with the fine vibration of her grip. Her face was doing the thing faces do when the person behind them is fighting very hard to keep the face from saying what the body already knows. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were moving across the room in small, deliberate arcs. Not panicking, mapping. He noticed that. The mapping. "Come with me," he said. "I have to finish my—" That wasn't a suggestion. She looked at him. Something moved behind her eyes, woke anger maybe, or the particular kind of pride that gets activated by being told what to do by the wrong person at the wrong time. He watched her decide against it. She set the tray on the table. He walked. She followed. The corridor behind the east service door was narrow and smelled like cold stone and the faint industrial residue of cleaning products, and Damien registered dimly that she would know this smell, that this was the world she moved through every day he'd been operating in his own, and he filed that thought away without examining it, because there was no time. Reeves was already on his earpiece. Damien could hear the low exchange without being able to make out the words. "Talk," Damien said to Serena. "About what?" "The pendant." Her hand went to her neckline involuntarily, reached for the chain, stopped, dropped back to her side. "It was my grandmother's." "What is it?" "It's a pendant." "Don't do that," he said. Not harshly, just precisely. "I don't have patience for it right now. Victor Barone has been in this business longer than I've been alive, and he went the color of a sheet when he saw it. So what is it?" She looked at him for a long moment. The corridor light was the bad kind, fluorescent and unforgiving. and in it he could see things the ballroom light had softened. The tiredness around her eyes, the set of her shoulders that came from months of labor, the specific quality of wariness that belonged to someone who had learned not to trust offered information. "I don't know," she said. "You don't know what the pendant is. I don't know what it means to him, to whoever that was. His name is Victor Barone." "That means nothing to me." Reeves came back. He bent toward Damien's ear and said 4 words. Damien went still. "How many?" he said. 2 confirmed, possibly 3. "Armed." 1 confirmed. Serena was watching this exchange with the expression of someone doing math very quickly. "What?" she said. Damien looked at her. He made a decision, not the kind that required weighing options, the kind that arrived whole and without debate, because the alternative was something he could not tolerate, and the reason he could not tolerate it was something he would not examine right now. "There are men at this party who came here to kill you," he said. She didn't flinch. He hadn't expected her to. "Why?" "That's what I'm going to find out." He looked at Reeves. "The East Tunnel. Go." The tunnel beneath the estate ran from a door behind the east wine cellar to an exit point beneath the gardener's outbuilding 400 meters north of the main house. Damien's father had built it in 1991 for reasons that had been explained to Damien at age 16 in the same flat and practical tone with which he'd been explained most things about the family business. The tunnel was dry and lit by industrial strips bolted to the ceiling, and it smelled like concrete and age. And Serena walked through it without speaking, with her arms close to her body and her head slightly forward, the posture of someone who had decided that moving was better than stopping regardless of destination. Damien walked behind her. Reeves was ahead. After 2 minutes of silence, she said, "Where are we going?" "Somewhere that isn't there." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have right now." She stopped walking. He almost ran into her. She turned around in the narrow space, and in the tunnel light, her face was doing something different than it had been doing. The wariness was still there, but behind it something harder, something that had been waiting and had now decided the wait was over. "I'm not going somewhere I don't know with someone I don't know," she said. "I've been working in your house for 11 months. I have cleaned your floors and your bathrooms and your windows, and I have never once been addressed by you as anything other than furniture. And now you want me to follow you through a tunnel under your property because you've decided I need protecting. Tell me why I should trust that." The tunnel hummed faintly from some ventilation source he'd never identified. "You don't," he said. "Trust it. That's not what's being offered." "Then what's being offered?" "The choice between a tunnel and a room where someone in it has a gun pointed at a direction that was yours 10 minutes ago." He paused. "You can go back if you want. Door's behind you." She looked at him. He let her look. He was aware, with some part of himself that he was also not examining, that this was not a normal conversation for this tunnel, that normally the people moving through it were his people, known quantities with known coordinates, and that the presence of this woman in it was a variable he had introduced himself through an act of, what? Impulse. Display. Something he'd thought was control and was now uncertain about. She turned back around and started walking. Enquête. The outbuilding was empty at this hour. Garden equipment ranked against the walls, smelling of oil and cut grass, and Reeves had a car outside. A black sedan, nondescript, one of 4 such vehicles the estate kept for what the household ledger described as grounds maintenance. And they were moving north through residential streets before Serena had fully oriented herself to being above ground again. She sat in the back seat. Damien sat beside her. The distance between them was approximately 18 inches, which, in the context of what had just happened, was either a lot or nothing at all. "The pendant," he said again. She pulled the chain from beneath her collar. The pendant was small, about the size of a large coin, dark metal, the face of it bearing an engraved design she'd looked at so many times, it had lost its specific character and become simply familiar. A rose, stylized, with a geometric border. She'd assumed it was decorative, the kind of thing a woman of her grandmother's generation wore because she'd been given it. Damien looked at it without touching it. His expression gave nothing away, but she had spent 11 months in proximity to the specific quality of his silence, and she had learned, without intending to distinguish between his silences. This one was the kind that meant recognition. You know what it is, she said. He didn't answer immediately. Damien. He looked up at her. The first time she had used his name. She felt it land, and she didn't take it back. It's a Valente mark, he said. The name meant nothing to her. She said so. It wouldn't, he said. It was before your time, before mine almost. The Valente family they were significant. In this city. In this network. He stopped. Started again more carefully. 20 years ago they were gone. The whole family, inside of 6 months. Death, disappearance, some combination of both. The business was absorbed into other structures. The name went away. He looked at the pendant again. Nobody has worn that mark since. She sat with that for a moment. The car moved through a yellow light. Outside, Chicago was doing what it did at this hour. Alive, relentless, indifferent. My grandmother's name, she said slowly, was Elsa Vale. She paused. She told me Vale was shortened. From something longer. She never told me what. The silence that followed had a different texture. Valente, he said. She didn't say anything. How much did she tell you about her past? Almost nothing. The truth of that had never bothered her until exactly this moment. She said the old country was the old country, and America was something else, and you built the new from the ground up. She said this twice a week approximately from the time I was 5. She heard her own voice going slightly flat, the vocal equivalent of the thing her face did when it was managing something it couldn't yet process. She died when I was 19. There was a lawyer with a letter she'd left, a bank account with $4,000 in it, and a box of things I was supposed to keep. The pendant was in the box. What else was in the box? Documents. Most of them in a language I couldn't read. Some photographs. She stopped. There was a photograph of a man and woman I didn't recognize. On the back it said Luca and Marina. That was all. She watched Damien's face and saw something she had seen on very few faces in her life. The look of a man who was doing the calculation and arriving at a number he had not expected. Luca Valente, he said, and Marina Valente. They were the last heads of the family. He turned to look at her fully, and there was something in his eyes that was neither the flat assessment of the ballroom nor the strategic focus of the tunnel, something more direct and also more careful. They had one child, a daughter, born before the family fell. The daughter was never found. He paused. The assumption was that she was dead. The car was very quiet. My parents, Serena said, and her voice came out smaller than she'd intended, disappeared when I was 3. My grandmother told me they had an accident. She never said what kind. She moved us 6 months later. She looked down at the pendant in her palm, the engraved rose, the geometric border. She moved us she said from overseas. I always thought she meant. She stopped talking because she didn't know what she had always thought, had never questioned it, had accepted the absence the way children accept the foundational absences of their lives, as weather, as given, as the shape of the world rather than an event within the world. Damien said carefully, Serena, don't. She closed her hand around the pendant. Don't say it out loud right now. He didn't. The car took a turn she didn't track, and they moved for a while in silence that was now a different kind of silence than any of the silences before. The safe house was a townhouse in a neighborhood that appeared completely ordinary, which was the point. Reeves opened the door and moved through the interior checking rooms with the systematic efficiency of someone for whom this was as routine as unloading a dishwasher, and Damien waited in the front hallway with Serena. And for the first time since the tunnel, she got a full look at him in still light. He looked tired. Not the tiredness of one night. The accumulated tiredness of a man who had been operating at a certain pitch for a very long time and had become so accustomed to it that he'd stopped registering it as a state. There was a tension in his jaw she recognized from the hallways of the estate and now understood as permanent rather than situational. Sit down, he said, not unkindly. I'm fine standing. He let it go. He took out his phone and made a call, turning slightly away. She caught fragments, a name she didn't know, the word Barone used twice, and then a pause followed by something she heard clearly. Find out who gave the order. When he turned back, his face had reset to the flatness of the ballroom. Victor Barone is 67 years old, he said. He was a secondary figure in the Valente organization before it collapsed. He moved into his own structure afterward, built himself up over 20 years. He's been at this event every year for the past decade. He sat down, finally, on the edge of a chair that didn't look designed for sitting on the edge of. He recognized the mark tonight, which means he knows what it represents, which means he either wants to protect it or he's one of the people who took it in the first place, she said. He looked at her. I'm not stupid, she said. Someone destroyed the family and took their territory. Those people would have strong reasons to make sure no heir ever appeared. She felt the sentence land in her own chest as she said it, felt its specific weight. Tonight I appeared. Yes. So the men at the party were not Barones, or they weren't only Barones. We're still working out the geometry. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. There are 3 families who absorbed Valente territory. All 3 were at the gala tonight. The quiet in the room was the kind that pressed. You shielded me, she said. Back there, when you turned. You put yourself between me and tactical decision. Was it? He didn't answer. She looked at him steadily. You didn't know any of this when you did it? I knew someone had fired a weapon in my house, he said, which is a problem regardless of who the target is. Right. Don't read into it. I'm not reading into anything. She sat down finally because her legs were finished pretending. The ankle was throbbing. She was so tired that the tiredness had gone past feeling and become a kind of static. I'm trying to understand what is happening to my life. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with a directness that surprised her, Your life was already complicated. You just didn't have the information to know why. She laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. My grandmother raised me to work hard and ask no questions and trust that what she didn't tell me was for my protection. She shook her head. I cleaned your floors for 11 months. I took the bus. I ate whatever was cheap. That was my life. It wasn't complicated. It was just... She stopped. Small. It wasn't small, he said. It was buried. She looked at him. There's a difference, he said. Before she could respond, Reeves came back into the room and said 2 words that changed the temperature of everything. Barone's here. Damien stood up. Here, he said. How? He followed the car. He's outside. He says he's alone. Reeves paused. He says he needs to speak to the girl. He says... Another pause. The pause of a man relaying something he finds difficult to organize. He says he knew her mother. The room held its breath. Serena stood up. Her legs had remembered how to work. Her hand found the pendant through the fabric of her uniform, and she held it there, pressed flat against her sternum, and she looked at Damien and said, Let him in. Serena, let him in. Damien looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Reeves. Reeves went to the door. And Victor Barone walked into the room, and he was not the same man who had gripped her wrist with the gray face of something ancient and afraid. He was smaller, somehow. His hands were in front of him in a gesture that was neither threatening nor entirely at peace, and his eyes went to her immediately and stayed there. And what was in them was something Serena did not have a word for, but recognized in the cellular way you recognize things that have to do with grief. I have been waiting, he said, for 20 years to look at that face. Serena said nothing. You have her eyes, he said. Marina's eyes. His voice had the particular roughness of a man who had not spoken about something for a very long time and was now finding the words had not aged well in their storage. I was there, the night your mother... The window to the left of the front door exploded inward, glass across the floor. The precise and terrible sound of a rifle shot, the subsonic crack that arrived a half-second after the damage, and Victor Barone dropped. Not wounded, Serena's mind registered in the fractional instant before everything became movement. Dropped because he knew the sound and his body had made the decision before his mind had. And Damien was already across the room, his hand on her arm, pulling her low, and Reeves was at the wall and drawing. And the second shot took out the lamp in the corner, and the room went dark, and the darkness lasted 4 seconds. Reeves had a flashlight on his belt and he used it, sweeping the room in one fast arc. Barone flat on the floor, hands over his head, unhit. The lamp destroyed, glass from the window distributed across 6 feet of hardwood in a pattern that told Damien the angle of entry was high, meaning elevated position, meaning the shooter was not on street level. He processed this in the time it took Serena to get her breathing under control beside him, which was fast. She was fast. "Move," he said. She moved. The back of the townhouse had a kitchen and a door that opened onto a narrow alley, and Reeves went through first with the flashlight off now, navigating by the ambient light from the alley, and Damien had Serena by the wrist. Not the grip Barone had used, different, functional. And Barone was behind them both, moving with the speed of a man 20 years younger than his age, which told Damien that whatever Victor Barone was, he was not soft. They went through the alley and into the adjacent street, and Reeves had already called for the second car, which arrived in 90 seconds. And in those 90 seconds, they stood against a brick wall in the cold, and Serena did not speak and did not shake, and Damien watched her not shaking with a specific and complicated attention. The car came, they got in. Barone tried to get in behind them. "No," Damien said. "I need to tell her. You led them here." Barone's face went through something difficult. "I wasn't followed. I checked. And yet." "Damien." The old man said his name with a familiarity that Damien had not authorized, and that landed wrong, the way a hand on the shoulder from a stranger lands wrong. "I have been protecting this information for 20 years. I did not survive this long to hand it to the wrong people tonight. Get in your own car, Victor. We'll talk when I've secured the location." Barone looked at Serena. She looked back at him. Something passed between them that Damien couldn't read and that irritated him in a way he didn't have time for. "The photograph on the back," Barone said to her, fast, before the door closed. "Luca and Marina. The date on it. Look at the date." Damien shut the door. Notasim. The second location was 40 minutes north, a property that appeared on no document connected to Damien's name or any name adjacent to it, a fact he had paid considerably for and maintained with a consistency that had now proven its value. A converted warehouse, interior walls, climate-controlled, 3 exits. Reeves swept it in 4 minutes, while Damien and Serena sat in the car in the sealed garage, and the silence between them had acquired a new quality, heavier, with the specific texture of 2 people who have been shot at together and are now in the processing period. Serena had the pendant out again. She was looking at it in the dark of the car, tilting it toward the faint light from the garage's single ceiling strip. "The photograph," she said. "He said to look at the date." "I heard him." "Do you know what he meant?" "I have a guess." "He didn't offer it. She didn't push." Reeves came back. They went inside. The interior of the warehouse had been finished simply. A main room, 2 smaller rooms off the back. A kitchen that functioned. Damien had used it 3 times in 10 years. He used it now. He put Serena in the main room with a glass of water she didn't drink, and he made 4 calls in the kitchen, standing at the window that showed him the alley behind the building, watching it while he talked. The calls told him the following. 2 of the 3 gunmen from the gala had been identified, both of them connected to a man named Petrov, which was a name that connected to a network that connected to one of the 3 families who had absorbed Valente territory. The 3rd gunman was still unidentified. The shot at the townhouse had come from a building 2 doors down, pre-positioned, which meant someone had known or anticipated the location, which meant the leak was not from the car or the route, but from something earlier, from something closer. He stood with that for a moment. Then he made a 5th call. Different number. Shorter. When he came back into the main room, Serena had found the pendant's clasp and taken it off and was holding it flat in her palm, examining the back of it. There was something engraved on the back that she was reading with the focused attention of someone who has just learned that an object they have owned their whole life is also a document. "There are initials," she said without looking up. "LV and MV." She paused. "And a date." "What date?" "September 14th. She looked up. 1999. Damien sat down across from her. "My parents disappeared in 1999, she said. "My grandmother moved us. She moved me. 6 months after. I was 3. She told me—" She stopped, reorganized. "She told me they had an accident. She said it was sudden. She said there was nothing to be done. Her voice was doing the flat thing again, the management thing. But underneath it, something was moving that the flatness could not entirely contain. She gave me the pendant when I was 7 and told me to keep it always. She said it was a family heirloom, nothing more. She was protecting you, Damien said. I know that. The sharpness in her voice was not aimed at him, but he received it anyway. I know she was protecting me. What I don't know, what I have never known, is what she was protecting me from. And it turns out I have been carrying the answer on a chain around my neck for 17 years without knowing what the question was. She set the pendant on the table between them. The engraved rose caught the light. Tell me what you know, she said. All of it. Not the version where you manage what I can handle. He looked at her. I cleaned your house for 11 months, she said. I have been shot at twice tonight. I think I have earned the unmanaged version. He considered that. Then he said, the Valente organization controlled 7 territories across Chicago and 2 in Detroit. Luca Valente built it over 15 years. He was not what most people in that business were. He ran it with a different framework, fewer casualties, more infrastructure, schools in certain neighborhoods, legitimate business fronts that actually functioned as legitimate businesses. He paused. He had enemies because of it. Because of the schools. Because of the legitimacy. Because what he was doing, done completely, would have changed the structure of the whole network, made it harder for the people who ran on pure violence to maintain territory. He was, without intending to be, a threat to a system that had worked for a long time. He turned the pendant over with one finger, not picking it up. 3 families decided the threat was more significant than the truce. They planned it over 2 years. The night of September 14th, 1999, Luca and Marina Valente attended a private gathering. They didn't come home from it. The room held very still. Their daughter was 3 years old, he said. She was with her grandmother, who had come to visit. The grandmother understood immediately what the disappearance meant, and she ran. She ran well, and she ran far, and she changed names. Valente de Val, first stop. And she kept running in the way that looks like ordinary life, which is the best cover there is. Serena said nothing for a long time. My grandmother knew, she finally said. She knew exactly what happened to them. Yes. She knew they didn't have an accident. Yes. The words sat between them like something that couldn't be taken back, which it couldn't. She was trying to keep you alive, he said. If you didn't know, you couldn't be used. You couldn't be manipulated into making a claim. You couldn't be hunted. The word came out flat and accurate. She kept me ignorant so I would be safe. And the night I happened to dance at the wrong party, in the wrong room with the wrong piece of jewelry around my neck, the ignorance stopped working. She picked up the pendant, closed her hand around it. 20 years of running, and she did everything right, and it still ended with someone shooting through a window. Damien watched her hand closed around the pendant, the knuckles not white. She wasn't gripping it, she was holding it, and the distinction felt important in a way he couldn't entirely name. Victor Barone, she said. He said he was there, the night they... I know what he said. What does that mean? Was he involved in what happened to them, or wasn't he? I don't know. That's not good enough. I know it isn't. He leaned forward. Which is why Barone needs to talk, fully, with no audience and no exits. She looked at him steadily. Bring him. Out him. Barone arrived 40 minutes later, escorted by 2 of Reeves's people, and he walked into the warehouse main room, and he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. He looked like a man who had been carrying something for 20 years and had arrived at the place where the carrying was going to end, one way or another. He sat across from Serena without being told to. He looked at her face for a moment with that same expression, the grief recognition, and then he straightened and looked at his hands. I was Luca's second, he said, for 6 years. I knew the organization from the inside, and I knew what the other families thought of what he was building, and I knew by early '99 that something was being planned. I tried to warn him. He stopped. He didn't believe me. He thought the truce held. Luca was brilliant at most things. He was not good at believing that people he'd worked alongside could want him dead. Did you go to the gathering? Serena asked. No, Barone said it, looking directly at her. I was supposed to. I didn't go. His jaw moved. I have spent 20 years knowing that if I had gone, I might have changed what happened, and also knowing that if I had gone, I would also be dead, and those two things have never resolved into anything comfortable. Who planned it? 3 men. 2 are dead. Natural causes, separate years. The third is still... Who? Barone was quiet. Victor. Damien's voice was the low, flat kind. We're past the part where you calculate. Barone looked at Damien, then at Serena. Then he said, his name is Aldrich Voss. He was the smallest of the 3 at the time. He absorbed the least territory, took the least visible role. He spent 20 years building in the background while the other 2 became visible targets. Barone paused. He is the most dangerous man in this city, and almost no one in the current generation knows his name. I know his name, Damien said. Serena looked at him. He's been at my table, Damien said. The way he said it had an edge to it, something she hadn't heard from him before. Not anger exactly, but the specific quality of a man confronting a blind spot. 3 times in the last 2 years. I thought he operates as a consultant for legal structures. He stopped. He's been watching you, Barone said, specifically, because you're the largest independent structure that hasn't been absorbed into his network, because you're the last significant piece that doesn't belong to him. He looked between them. And now you have her, which means he has 2 reasons to move, Damien said. Tonight, Barone said. I think he moves tonight. The gala was already a setup, not for her. He didn't know she'd be there. But when she appeared, when the pendant appeared, the gala became something else. He leaned forward. He has enough people in enough positions. If he decides the window is open, Damien's phone went off. He looked at the screen. The muscle in his jaw did something brief and controlled. What? Serena said. He turned the phone toward her. A message, 4 words, from a number she didn't recognize. Reeves is with Voss. The room went cold. Serena looked at the door Reeves had walked out of 40 minutes ago to coordinate the perimeter. Damien was already moving toward the front of the building, not running, but close to it, and she was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to stand, and Barone was saying something behind her that she didn't fully register because her mind was doing a fast and awful calculation. Reeves had been with Damien for how long? Reeves had known the first safe house location. Reeves had swept this location and reported it clear. Reeves had been the one to position the perimeter, which meant Reeves had been the one to... The lights went out. Not a flicker. A full cut, immediate, the kind that meant the external source had been severed, not a breaker. The kind that was done deliberately by someone who knew where the external source was, which was not information that appeared on any document, but which was absolutely something you would learn if you spent 20 minutes walking the perimeter with the specific intention of learning it. In the darkness, Damien said, "Southeast exit, now." She moved toward his voice. Her hand found his arm in the dark, and she grabbed it not because she needed to be led, but because contact in total darkness was orientation, was the difference between moving fast and moving into a wall. He registered the grip and moved, and she moved with him, and behind them Barone was breathing hard and following by sound. The southeast exit was a fire door that opened onto a narrow exterior passage between the warehouse and the building adjacent. Damien hit the bar release and the door opened and the cold air came in, and for 1/2 second everything was possible. The passage was there, the passage was empty, and then the figure at the end of it moved out of the shadow, and she knew the shape before the figure raised his weapon because she had been in proximity to that shape for 11 months. Reeves, 40 feet away, dark clothes, the gun already up. Damien stopped. She stopped beside him. "How long?" Damien said. His voice was the flattest she had ever heard it. Reeves said nothing. "How long, Marcus?" "Long enough," Reeves said. And the particular quality of the 2 words, not apologetic, not performing, just landed and done, told her this was not a man in conflict. Whatever calculation had been made before tonight and had been maintained with the cold functionality of someone who had simply been waiting. Barone had come through the door behind them. She heard his sharp intake of breath. "Drop it," Reeves said. He was not talking to Damien. He was looking at her. The pendant. Drop it on the ground. Don't, Damien said. I'm not talking to you. Reeves took 3 steps forward, now 30 feet. The pendant on the ground and you walk. Both of you. That's the offer. Serena looked at the pendant in her hand. She hadn't realized she'd been holding it, had taken it off the table when she stood, automatic, the body keeping what the body knew was important. She looked at Reeves, at the gun, at the distance between them. She thought about her grandmother in a small living room that smelled like lavender, saying trust begins with the body. She thought about Luca and Marina Valente, September 14th, 1999, attending a private gathering and not coming home. She thought about 20 years of running dressed as ordinary life. She closed her hand around the pendant. No, she said. Reeves moved the gun 2 inches toward Damien. Last offer, he said. And in the 3 seconds that followed, 3 things happened nearly simultaneously. Damien moved left, drawing the gunfire away from her. Barone, 67 years old and apparently not as finished as he looked, went right and low with the speed of someone who had made this kind of calculation before. And Serena, without thinking, without planning, with the complete absence of strategy and the complete presence of something older than strategy, ran forward directly at Reeves and closed the 30 feet before his aim had fully reacquired and hit him with her full weight, shoulder into his chest, the way her body knew how to move because her body had always known how to move. And the gun discharged into the ceiling of the passage, and they went down together onto the concrete, and the pendant pressed hard into her palm, and she thought, with strange clarity, that her grandmother had been right about. The concrete was cold, and the weight of Reeves was considerable, and the gun was somewhere between them in the tangle of it, and Serena's shoulder screamed from the impact, but she did not stop moving because stopping was the only option that ended badly. She had his wrist. Both hands on his wrist, the gun hand, pressing it into the ground with everything she had, which was not enough. He was bigger and heavier and recovering from the surprise faster than she needed him to. And then Damien was there, his knee on Reeves's chest, his hand on the gun, and the 3 of them were a single violent knot on the concrete floor of the passage for 4 seconds that felt like much longer. And then the gun was in Damien's hand, and Reeves went still. Not surrendered. Still. The way a man goes still when he's recalculating, not when he's finished. Serena rolled off him and got to her feet. Her palm was bleeding. The pendant's edge had cut into it during the fall, a thin line across the heel of her hand. Not deep. She closed her hand around it anyway. Kept it. Damien stood over Reeves with the gun pointed down, and his breathing was the only sound for a moment. Controlled, deliberate, the breathing of a man managing something enormous with the machinery of long practice. Barone was against the wall, unhurt. His face had the gray quality again. Get up, Damien said to Reeves. Reeves got up slowly. There was blood on his eyebrow from somewhere in the fall. He touched it with 2 fingers and looked at what came away on them with the flat detachment of someone taking inventory. How many are coming? Damien said. Reeves looked at him. Marcus. The name again, with weight. How many? Enough, Reeves said. That's the 2nd time you've said that word. It's not an answer. It's the only answer I have. Reeves said it without defiance. Just fact. I don't know the full deployment. I was given a task. I completed the task. You didn't complete it? A pause. No. Damien studied him. The gun didn't waver. How long have you been with Voss? 4 years. 4 years. Serena watched Damien receive that. Watched the specific quality of stillness that moved through him. The kind that was not calm, but was the thing built over calm as a necessary architecture. 4 years meant everything Reeves had done in 4 years needed to be reassessed. Every security arrangement, every location, every piece of information passed through that position. 4 years was not a betrayal that could be contained. It was a structural failure that went all the way down. She watched Damien understand that in real time. Watched him decide what to do with the understanding, which was to put it somewhere internal and close the door. The Opera House, Barone said. Both of them looked at him. Voss's staging location, Barone said. He was looking at the ground, speaking with the deliberate quality of someone releasing something they've held for a very long time. He has always used the Caro Opera House. It was Valente property. He kept it because Luca and Marina... He stopped. Started again. It was the last place they were seen. He kept it because he is the kind of man who keeps trophies, not objects. Places. His jaw set. If he is moving tonight, he is moving from there. Damien looked at Reeves. True? Reeves, after a moment, said, True. How many men on site? Silence. Marcus? I don't know the number. A pause that had a different quality than the previous silences. The quality of a man at the edge of something. 12, maybe? 15. He called in people for tonight specifically. 12. 15. Against what? Damien with one gun in a passage outside a warehouse with a compromised perimeter. Serena with a cut hand and a pendant. An old man who was still breathing. She looked at Damien. He was already looking at her. We go, she said. Serena, we go. She heard herself say it and felt the truth of it in her chest before she could analyze it. The specific and irrevocable truth of someone who has stopped running. He had my parents killed. He's been running from a 3-year-old girl for 20 years. Tonight I showed up. She looked at the pendant in her bleeding hand. Tonight I stopped letting him run from me and start running at him. Damien looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Barone. Can you get people to the Caro in 40 minutes? Barone said, I can get 8. Get 12. I can try for 12. Try harder. He looked at Reeves. Something moved across his face that was not mercy and not rage, but was something in the difficult geography between them. You have one choice left. You know that. Reeves said nothing. You come with us, or I leave you here and someone eventually finds you. Your choice aligns with your odds. He paused. I know you know this building better than anyone. I know you positioned the perimeter, which means you know every approach. That knowledge has a value tonight. The gun stayed up. But I will not carry a liability into a building with 15 armed men, so make a choice and make it fast. Reeves looked at the ground. Then he looked up and said, I'll take you in through the south, so... The Caro Opera House had been closed for 11 years. It sat on a street that had been commercial once and was now in the particular state of urban pause. Not declined, not developed, just waiting. And from the outside it looked like what it was. A beautiful abandoned building, its facade still intact, its marquee empty, its doors sealed with boards that were more symbolic than structural. They came in from the south, not through the doors. Reeves had been right about one thing, or right enough. He knew the approach. He led them through a service access on the building's south face that required moving through a neighboring property's basement and up through a passage that smelled like 70 years of accumulated dark. And Serena moved through it with her shoulder still screaming and her hand wrapped in a strip of cloth Damien had torn from his own shirt without commentary, the cut held closed, the pendant inside her fist. Damien was ahead. 2 of Barone's people, the first to arrive, more were coming, were behind. Barone himself was outside coordinating, which was the right call and which he'd accepted without argument, which told Serena something about what he thought his remaining usefulness was in close spaces. Reeves was between Damien and the 2 men, watched from both sides. He had not been given a weapon. He had been given the specific mercy of being allowed to be useful, and he was using it. They came up through the passage into what had been the building's south service wing. Storage rooms, costume racks still draped in rotting fabric, a prop room that held the ghosts of 100 productions in the form of furniture under dust sheets. The building around them was not silent. They could hear voices, not words, just the ambient sound of men deployed in a space, the particular acoustic of a group of people trying not to make noise and making it anyway. Damien stopped, held up a hand. Everyone stopped. He listened, moved 2 fingers to the right. They moved right. The backstage area opened onto the stage itself through a set of heavy curtains that had once been crimson and were now the color of dried blood, which Serena noted with the part of her brain that was still noticing things. And through the gap in the curtains, she could see the stage proper, and beyond it, the main house. The seats, row on row in the darkness. the balconies rising on either side, the ceiling high and vaulted and full of shadow. And in the middle of the stage, under a single work light, someone had rigged to a generator, sitting in a chair with the posture of a man entirely comfortable with the space around him, was Aldrich Voss. She had not known what she expected. Whatever she expected, it wasn't this. A man of 60, slight, with gray hair kept short, and a face that was ordinary in the way that certain very dangerous things are ordinary, unremarkable until you understood the context, and then impossible to look away from. He was dressed plainly. He had no visible weapon. He looked like a consultant, which was exactly what Damien had taken him for, and she understood in that moment the specific genius of that particular camouflage. He was looking at the stage as if he owned it. He did own it. It had been Valente property. He had taken it. She counted the men she could see without moving, 4 on the stage floor, 2 at the far doors, 1 on the left balcony, 7 visible. More she couldn't see. Damien crouched beside her at the curtain gap, and she felt the warmth of him. Not as a comfort, as information, as the physical fact of someone present and alive. And he said, at the lowest possible register, "We wait for Baron's people." "How long?" 20 minutes. "He knows we're here." A pause. "Probably." She looked through the curtain at Voss. He had not moved. He was looking at the stage the way a man looks at something he's thought about for a long time. "He's been here before," she said. "He comes back here." "Yes." "Why?" Damien was quiet for a moment. "Because he needs to believe it was worth it." She thought about that. She thought about what it meant to take something from someone, not the territory, not the business, but the 2 people who built it, and then spend 20 years returning to the place where you took it, trying to feel the thing you thought taking it would give you. She thought about what kind of emptiness that produced over 20 years, and she felt no sympathy for it, none, but she understood its shape. "He's going to keep doing it," she said. "Yes." "Until there's nothing left to come back to." She looked at Damien. "Or until there's someone here who won't let him." He looked at her. She stood up. "Serena." She was already moving through the curtain. She walked onto the stage in the white servant's uniform she had put on 16 hours ago in the staff room of the Moretti estate, the pendant in her hand, the cut on her palm seeping slowly through the cloth wrapping, and the work light hit her, and she stopped walking in the middle of it and looked at Aldrich Voss. He looked at her. She watched him see her, watched him process the uniform, the pendant, her face, watched something move through his expression that was not surprise. He had known she was in the building. She had been right about that. But was something else, something she took a moment to identify. Recognition. Not of her specifically, of what she represented, of the shape of the thing he had spent 20 years trying to erase arriving in a form he hadn't calculated for. "You look like her," he said. His voice was mild, conversational, the voice of a man in a meeting. "Marina," she said. "Yes." "I know your name," she said. "I know what you did. I know why. And I know that you have spent 20 years coming back to this building." She watched his face. "Why?" He tilted his head slightly. The 4 men on the stage floor had moved in her peripheral vision. She tracked them without looking directly, the way her grandmother had taught her to track a room. "What a strange question." "Answer it." "No." Not rudely, flatly. "You're not here to ask me questions. You're here because you think arriving in the light is a strategy. You've been on a stage once tonight, and it worked, and you think stages are yours now." He looked at the pendant. "It's a small piece of metal. It's a family. Your family is dead." "Not entirely," she said. And from behind her, from the wings, from the doors at the back of the house, from the balconies on both sides, the sound of arrival, of people coming into the space, taking positions, the particular acoustic of a room changing from occupied by one side to occupied by 2. Baron's people. 12, he'd said. She didn't count. She kept her eyes on Voss. He heard it. He sat still through it. His expression did not change, and she recognized that too. the expression of a man who had already calculated for this contingency, and the recognition of it sent a cold current through her chest. "I've been in this business for 40 years, he said. "Do you know what I learned in the first 5? He stood up, slow, the chair scraping back. "The person who walks into the light is never the threat. The person who walks into the light is the distraction." And from directly above them, from the catwalks that ran across the ceiling of the stage house, 40 feet up, which no one had checked because no one had known they needed to be checked, because the person who would have known that they needed to be checked had led them in from the south, came the sound of movement, and Serena looked up and saw the shadows shifting in the catwalks. 3 of them, maybe 4, and in the same instant she heard Damien shout her name from the wings with a quality in his voice she had not heard from him before, and the work light above her swung on its rigging, and she understood in a single and complete moment that the light was not rigged to a stationary point, it was rigged to a line, and the line was controlled from above, and Voss had not been sitting under it because he liked the light. He had been sitting under it to mark the position. She threw herself sideways. The light came down. It hit the stage floor where she'd been standing with a sound like a small catastrophe, glass and metal, and the generator cables snapping taut, and then the whole stage plunging into dark again, and she was on her hands and knees on the boards with her shoulder reignited and her ears ringing, and somewhere in the darkness Voss was moving. She could hear it, the specific deliberate steps of a man who had mapped this room long ago and could navigate it without light. And she was in a space she didn't know in the dark with no bearings and a cut hand. And she pressed her palm flat to the floor. Her grandmother's voice. "Trust begins with the body." The floor told her things. Vibration, direction. The boards were old and loose in certain places, and each step had a signature, and she gathered them in the seconds she had. And she built a map from the soles of her hands, and she stood. The first shot came from the balcony and hit the stage floor 6 feet to her left. She moved right. The second shot came from the catwalk, and she was already moving again, not away, toward the sound of Voss's steps, because away was the direction he wanted her, and she had made her decision about his directions. She could hear fighting in the wings. She could hear Damien, not his voice, the sound of him moving, and the sounds adjacent to that, impacts, someone going down, and she could hear Baronne's people engaging the balcony positions, and the whole building had become a single violent sound, and she moved through it like she had moved through the waltz, finding the floor, finding the measure, finding her hand closed on fabric. Voss's jacket. He turned fast. She was already inside his reach, which was not a position she had planned, but was the position she was in, and she used it. She drove her elbow up and made contact with his jaw and felt it in her own shoulder, like a repayment for every insult her body had taken tonight, and he made a sound and went sideways, and she went with him, staying inside, staying close, because close was the only place she was bigger than him. He caught her wrist, twisted. She went with the twist instead of against it, rotated her whole body, broke the grip. He reached for her throat. A light came on. Not the work light. Something smaller. A tactical flashlight from the direction of the wings. Damien or one of Baronne's people. The beam sweeping and finding the stage floor and then finding them. And in the light she could see Voss's face clearly, 6 inches from hers, and what she saw on it was not fear. It was focus. Pure and cold and undistracted. He was not afraid of her. He was still calculating. His hand found the pendant, the chain, her fist still closed around it. And he pulled. The chain bit into the back of her hand and she held on, and he pulled harder and she felt the chain cutting and she did not open her hand. "Drop it," he said. "You first," she said. And in the flashlight beam she saw something pass through his expression. A small, brief, involuntary thing, there and gone, that she would later understand was the first moment Aldrich Voss, in 40 years of operating in these rooms, encountered something he had not specifically prepared for. Not a threat, not a weapon. The specific and immovable quality of someone who had decided, at the bottom of everything, that there was nothing left to lose, and therefore nothing left to calculate. He had taken everything from her family. He had not anticipated that, 20 years later, what remained would be standing on this specific stage, bleeding, holding a piece of metal that cost nothing and meant everything. Refusing, his hand was still on the chain. She could feel the links biting into the heel of her cut hand, the specific thin fire of metal against an open wound, and she registered it the way you register pain when you have decided pain is not the relevant variable. Noted, filed, not acted on. Her grip did not loosen. Voss pulled harder. She pulled back. They were standing 18 inches apart in the flashlight beam, and the fighting was still happening around them. She could hear it in the balconies, on the catwalks, the specific sounds of people hitting the ground and people staying up. And Voss had the particular focus of a man who had narrowed his entire operational field to this one point, this chain, this piece of metal that he had apparently decided was the axis on which everything turned. Maybe it was. Maybe he was right about that. Damien came through the dark from the left side and hit Voss with his shoulder at full speed, and the three of them went down in a tangle on the old stage boards, and the chain snapped. Not broke. The clasp gave. The pendant came loose. She felt it happen, felt the chain go slack in her fist. Her hand came up and she had the pendant. The pendant was there, in her closed palm, the clasp broken, but the thing itself intact. And Voss was under Damien on the stage floor with one arm trapped behind him and the other searching for purchase and finding none. She stood. Her shoulder was wrong in a way that was getting harder to manage. Her palm was open and bleeding freely now, the cloth wrapping lost somewhere in the fall. She was breathing in the deliberate way of someone who has made breathing a conscious act because the body has stopped doing it automatically. She looked at Voss. He was on his stomach. Damien had his weight across him and one hand at the back of his neck, and the gun pressed to the side of his head, and Voss had gone still. Not the recalculating still, a different still. The still of a man who has reached the end of his available moves and knows it. The sounds in the building were changing. The fighting was resolving. She could hear it the way you hear a storm turning, the random violence of it becoming more directional, more concentrated, the sounds of Baron's people consolidating position in the dark. A light came on in the balcony. Then another. Someone had found the secondary power source. The Caro Opera House assembled itself out of the dark in pieces. Its ceiling, high and cracked and beautiful. Its empty seats, row on row, their velvet rotted to a memory of velvet. Its stage, wide and bare except for the three of them and the wreckage of the work light, and 20 years of dust undisturbed until tonight. Voss turned his head as much as Damien's grip allowed, and looked at her. Just looked, with the flat, total attention of a man doing a final assessment of something he had not correctly calculated. "You're bleeding," he said. "I know. You should have dropped it. I know that's what you think." He was quiet for a moment. The building settled around them. From the balcony a voice called down, one of Baron's people, confirming something in a low, clear tone, and what they confirmed was that the men on the catwalks were down and the men at the doors were disarmed, and what remained of Voss's deployment was in the process of being contained. 12 men, Reeves had said. Maybe 15. It had been 14. 3 were in the catwalks. 4 had come in through the back of the house. The rest had been positioned in ways that Reeves had known about. And Reeves, she thought about Reeves and what Reeves had done in the South Passage and what that act would cost him, had laid them out before Baron's people arrived. Not all of it charity. Some of it the particular calculus of a man choosing which debt he could partially repay. 4 of Baron's people were hurt. 1 badly. A man named Correa, who had taken a shot in the upper chest and was being stabilized on the floor of the main house by 2 others who knew what they were doing. She had seen him when the lights came back, and she looked at him now from the stage, and she held that. The specific weight of a man she had never met taking a bullet in a building that was her legacy, her inheritance, her name made concrete. She held it. She did not put it down. Voss was bound and seated in the chair he had started the evening in, which had a symmetry that no one acknowledged and everyone registered. The work light had been replaced by 3 tactical lamps positioned to cover the stage, and the opera house in their combined light had a stark and unglamorous reality that felt appropriate. All the beauty of the architecture still present, but no longer able to function as atmosphere. Just structure. Just bones. Baron came in from the South Passage. He looked at Voss with a stillness that was different from the stillness of men who were managing anger. His stillness was old. It had been waiting for this room for a long time. He walked to the center of the stage and he stood in front of Voss, and the two men looked at each other with the specific quality of people who share a long and damaging history and have arrived at its final chapter with no illusions about what it cost. "Victor," Voss said, as if greeting him at an event. "Don't," Barone said. Voss closed his mouth. Barone turned to Serena. She was sitting on the edge of the stage, her legs over the side, her injured hand wrapped in fresh cloth that Damien had found somewhere and had wrapped himself, working with a careful precision she had not expected and had not commented on. She looked at Barone. "What you asked me," she said, "earlier, in the townhouse, before the window." She paused. "You were going to tell me you were there. The night of September 14th, you said you were there." "I was there," he said. "Tell me the rest of it." He sat down in the nearest chair, the careful way of an old man whose body was making its own inventory. "I arrived late. I told Damien I had been warned and didn't go, but that was the shortened version." His jaw worked. "I arrived late. The gathering was in a private room on the second floor of a building that no longer exists on Carlin Street. When I got there, the room was already done. Luca was gone. Marina was—" He stopped, restarted. "Marina was still alive when I found her, for a few minutes." The stage held its breath. "She told me the child was safe. She had made sure of it. Had called Elsa 2 days before, when she understood what was coming, had put arrangements in place. She made me promise." He looked at Serena directly. "She made me promise that if the child was alive and hidden, I would leave her that way, that I would not find her, that I would not surface her into this world." He paused. Marina understood what surfacing would mean. She had lived in this world her whole life. She knew what a Valente heir would attract. "She was right," Serena said. "She was always right." He said it with the simplicity of someone who had held that truth for 20 years without ever being able to speak it to anyone who mattered. "I kept the promise. For 20 years. He looked at the pendant, which she was still holding. "Tonight you surfaced yourself, without knowing, and He stopped. "When I saw the mark, I panicked. I grabbed your wrist and I was not gentle about it. I'm sorry for that." Serena looked at him. The apology sat between them, real and imperfect and late, and she did not rush to resolve it. "She died right after," he said. "Marina, she was already—" He stopped. He looked at his hands. "I've been coming to the edge of this city's network for 20 years, close enough to watch, far enough to honor the promise, waiting for something I couldn't have named." He looked up. "And then a maid danced at the Black Rose Gala, and the whole room stopped breathing, and I looked at her face, and I knew." Serena's throat was doing something she did not allow it to complete. She breathed through it, in and out. "She asked you to leave me hidden," she said. "Not ignorant, hidden." "Yes." "She didn't ask you to let them walk free." "No." His voice went flat. "She didn't ask me that." She looked at Voss. Voss met her gaze with the same quality he'd had throughout, that total, undeflected attention of a man who had never once doubted the legitimacy of his own choices. And she understood, looking at him now, that this was the most dangerous thing about him, not the network, not the 40 years, the absolute absence of doubt. "You came back here every year," she said. He said nothing. "Why?" Still nothing. "I want you to say it." She stood up from the edge of the stage. Her shoulder protested, and she didn't give it the satisfaction of acknowledgement. She walked toward him until she was standing over him in the work light, and she looked down at him the way he had looked out at the empty house when she'd come through the curtain, with the absolute possession of someone who belongs in the space. "Not for me. Not for anyone else. Because I think you've never said it out loud in 40 years, and I think you need to hear what it sounds like in this room." Voss was quiet for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Because it wasn't enough." She looked at him. "Luca built something," he said, and for the first time his voice had something in it other than flatness. Not remorse, nothing as clean as remorse, but the specific texture of a wound that had never closed properly. "He built something that I could not build, that I have spent 40 years trying to build, that I—" He stopped. "Taking it didn't give it to me. I thought it would. I came back here to understand why it didn't." He looked at the empty house, at the rotted velvet and the cracked plaster and the dark that lived in its corners. I've been trying to understand for 20 years. And? She said. He looked at her. I never did. She stood with that for a moment. She let it be what it was. Not a confession that redeemed anything, not a revelation that changed the accounting, but a truth stated plainly in the building where it was born, by the man who owed it. No, she said. You never will. She turned away from him. She walked back to where Damien was standing at the edge of the light, and he looked at her with the particular quality she had been slowly learning to read. Not the flat assessment, not the strategic focus, something that lived underneath those things and was less controlled and more real. It's done, she said. Not yet, he said. She knew what he meant. She nodded once. Inside. The calls went out before dawn. Not all at once. Sequentially, carefully, in the specific order that Barone had been constructing in his head for 20 years, and that Damien had the infrastructure to execute. Every family head who had been at the Black Rose Gala received a message before sunrise. Not a threat, not a declaration, an invitation to a meeting at a time and location to be confirmed on a matter of historical significance that affected the structural integrity of the current network. Professional language, precise. Every one of them came. The meeting took place 3 weeks later in a room that was deliberately neutral, a conference space in a building that belonged to no one present, in a part of the city that was equidistant from every major territory. 40 people. Every significant structure in Chicago's underworld, and the 2 connected to Detroit, and one from further that had sent a representative as a courtesy. Serena stood at the head of the table in a dark suit that was not a uniform. She had practiced nothing. She had written nothing down. She had sat with Damien the night before in the kitchen of a house she was beginning to understand she would be living in for some time, and he had asked her what she was going to say, and she had thought about it for a long moment and said the truth, just the truth, in the right order. He had looked at her in the way he looked at her now, from his seat at the table, not beside her, deliberately not beside her, because this was not his moment to anchor, this was hers. With the quality she had finally, 3 weeks after the Opera House, allowed herself to fully identify. Not strategic, not managed, the way a man looks at something he did not expect, and has not yet found the category for, and has stopped trying to find the category for. She began. She told them the history of the Valente family and its destruction with specificity and documentation. Barone had spent 20 years accumulating both, quietly, carefully, in the way of a man who knew that one day accuracy would matter more than anything. She told them what Aldrich Voss had done, and how, and who had been involved, and what had happened to the other 2 men who had been involved. She told them about the territory that had been divided, and the name that had been erased, and the child who had been hidden in plain sight for 20 years cleaning floors. She put the pendant on the table. The room was completely silent. She told them that the Valente name was being restored. Not as a claim on territory. Most of the absorbed land had changed hands multiple times in 20 years, and she had no interest in relitigating a map. As a name, as a presence, as the thing her father had been building before someone decided it was too inconvenient to let him finish. He was building something functional, she said. Not clean. There is no clean in this room, and I won't pretend there is. But functional. Infrastructure that outlasted the violence instead of being made of it. She looked around the table. The faces varied in expression, but not one of them was inattentive. I know what this network has been since he died. I know what Voss built in his place. I know what the last 20 years cost in territories that used to be different. She paused. I'm not here to offer an ultimatum. I'm here to demonstrate a presence. The Valente name exists. I exist. What you do with that information is your own calculation. She picked up the pendant. But I will not be invisible again. The silence held for another moment. Then the man from Detroit said, What do you want? It was the first question, and it was the right question, and she answered it directly and in specific terms. And the conversation that followed lasted 4 hours. And it was not easy, and it was not friendly, and 3 men at the table tested the edges of what she would accept, and found those edges clearly delineated. And by the end of it, the room had arrived at something that was not an agreement so much as a recognition. that the variable had changed, that the map required updating, that the name at the top of this particular column was different now. No one applauded. This was not that kind of room, but no one left early. That was the thing that mattered. Months moved through Chicago the way months do, with indifference, with weather, with the ordinary accumulation of days that are not historic and are not nothing. The Caro Opera House was deeded back to Valente Holdings 6 weeks after the meeting. Serena stood in it the first morning with Barone and looked at the stage in daylight through the dirty skylights, and she thought about what the building had held in its walls. The last night of her parents' lives, and then 20 years of Voss returning to a failure he couldn't articulate. And then the night the pendant came down with her to the floor, and the chain broke, but the thing itself survived. "What will you do with it?" Barone asked. She looked at the ceiling. The bones of the place were good. "Fix it," she said. He looked at her. "My father built things," she said. "Apparently." She touched the wall, cold plaster, solid underneath. "I want to see what that looks like from the inside." She re-established the Valente name, not with ceremony but with paperwork and presence, the two most durable materials available. She built the administrative structure carefully, with Barone's knowledge and Damien's infrastructure serving as adjacent resources rather than foundations. Because the foundation needed to be hers, that much she understood without being told. She made decisions that were sometimes wrong and corrected them. She made alliances that cost her things she had not fully valued until she spent them. Reeves was tried internally. The network had its own processes for this, which she was now part of, and the outcome was not death, which surprised several people, and was not freedom, which surprised no one. He served a specific and defined function in a specific and defined location, which was a form of accounting that she had proposed, and that Damien had looked at her sideways about for a long moment before agreeing. She had thought about Marcus Reeves in the South Passage, choosing to lay out Voss's positions. She had thought about what that choice cost him and what it was worth, and she had arrived at a number that was not zero. She thought about her grandmother often. She thought about Elsa Vale in a small living room putting a pendant in a box next to documents in a language she never taught her granddaughter, leaving instructions with a lawyer, building the most elaborate and patient form of love available to someone who could not afford to be visible about it. She thought about the cold mornings, and the correction and the repetition and trust begins with the body, and she understood now that her grandmother had been giving her more than technique in those mornings. She had been giving her the only inheritance she could transfer without leaving a trail. She thought about Luca and Marina Valente, September 14th, 1999. Two people who went to a gathering and understood in the final hours that what they had built would outlast what was being done to them, because they had already placed it somewhere safe. She thought about Marina alive for a few minutes in a room on Carlin Street, telling Barone, "The child is safe." I made sure. She had been made sure of. By everyone who could reach her. Now she was the one doing the reaching. The Caro Opera House reopened on a Saturday in October, 11 months after the night of the Black Rose Gala. Not with fanfare. A soft opening, by any reasonable standard, an orchestra, a modest audience, the building restored to the basic condition of functionality without the elaborate cosmetics of complete renovation, which would come later. In stages, the way things that were built to last were built. Serena stood backstage in the wings before the performance and listened to the building fill. The sounds of people arriving, finding their seats. The specific acoustic of the house filling with presence. Damien came and stood beside her. They had arrived at something over these months that neither of them had named with precision, which suited them both. It was functional and real and had been tested in conditions that most things were never tested in and had not failed, which was a more meaningful standard than most. He stood beside her with the comfortable proximity of someone who had stopped calculating the distance. "Ready?" he said. "No," she said. "Good." She looked at him. "Ready is for people who haven't been through anything," he said. "You know what you're walking out into. That's different." She thought about that. It was true, and it was not comfort, and it was better than comfort. It was the kind of thing you said to someone you were not trying to protect from the truth, and she had learned over these months that this was how she understood him, not by what he offered, but by what he did not bother to cushion. You called it a catastrophic mistake, she said. The night of the gala. I heard you say it. He was quiet for a moment. I did. Were you wrong? He looked at her. Oh, the wings were dim and the sounds from the house were growing, and somewhere in the building the orchestra was settling into its first tuning notes. And he looked at her with the quality she had stopped trying to categorize and started simply recognizing. Yes, he said. I was wrong. She nodded once. She straightened. She looked at the stage, at the board she had gone down on, at the place where the chain had broken and the thing itself had survived, at the working lights and the restored rigging and the marks on the floor from 20 years of maintenance and neglect, and one night that had changed the shape of everything. She walked out onto the stage. The house was not full. 300 people, perhaps, in a house that could seat 1,200. But every person in it was present in the specific way of people who understood the significance of the room they were sitting in. And when she walked into the light, they went quiet in the same way the Black Rose Gala had gone quiet 11 months ago. Not because she was a maid, not because she was an heir, not because of the story, which most of them knew by now in its broad outlines, the way important stories move through the structures of people who live adjacent to power. Because of the quality of her presence in the light, because of what it costs to stand in a particular place and what it shows, when you stand there, about what you've paid. The orchestra began. Not a waltz, something older, something with more weight to it, a piece that had been chosen with the specific intention of filling a large space and not pretending it was anything else. She did not dance. She stood in the light and she let the music fill the house, and she held the pendant, the clasp repaired now, the chain new, the pendant itself unchanged, in her hand at her side, and she looked out at the 300 people in the seats, and she thought about a woman in a small living room in the early morning saying, "The day will come when you need to trust yourself completely," and she thought, here it is. Here is the day. The music moved through the building held it. Outside, Chicago continued in its relentless and indifferent way. The city doing what cities do, absorbing its own history into its streets, moving forward over the places where important things happened without marking most of them, leaving only the buildings and the names and the people who remembered to carry what deserved to be carried. The Valente name was one of those things now. Not a ghost, not a claim, a presence, active and ongoing, in the hands of someone who had cleaned its floors without knowing they were hers, who had been invisible in its corridors for 11 months, who had been placed on a ballroom floor as a joke, and had turned the joke into something that no one in that room would ever fully put down. The music ended. The house was still for one breath, too, the held quality of an audience that has received something and is not yet ready to release it. Then the applause. Serena stood in the light of the Cairo Opera House and let it come. She did not perform for it. She did not bow. She stood with her feet on the floor her father had walked and her hands at her sides and her face turned toward the house, and she held the weight of it the way you hold something that was always yours and that you have finally, after everything, stopped being afraid to carry. The pendant was warm in her palm. The building held its breath and then released it. And the story, the one that had started with a cruel joke and a white uniform and a ballroom floor in the criminal heart of Chicago, settled into its final shape. Not a triumph, exactly, not the clean kind, but the real kind, which was harder and heavier and worth exactly what it cost, which had been considerable, which would continue to cost in ways not yet visible, which was the nature of things that mattered and did not pretend otherwise. Serena Vale stood in the light. The music had ended. She remained.